I think it's clear that Putin's plan has not worked out. Ukraine is now the biggest and the strongest military in Europe. The two key goals of the war, I think, have clearly not been achieved by the Russians. They've clearly failed to do that. But I don't think that Putin has modified his goals long term. I don't think he can really. And he's basically tied his entire legacy to this war, to this invasion. So he really is, he's trapped in a war now that he doesn't seem to have a way to win, doesn't seem to have an obvious pathway to victory, but he can't get out of it really. If he were to turn around now and say, okay, we're going to agree to a compromise peace, we're going to take the territories that we have now and we're going to accept them and we're going to allow the rest of Ukraine, so 20% of Ukraine, which is under Russian occupation, would be taken to Russia, either de jure or more likely de facto, but 80% of Ukraine would be free. And that 80% of Ukraine, the Ukrainian state, would continue on its pathway to European integration. That's a major defeat for Russia.
Joining me today is Peter Dickinson, a British journalist, an editor at Atlantic Council and a publisher of Business Ukraine magazine. Welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Peter, we are meeting in Kyiv on the first anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and actually Vladimir Putin 4 years ago promised to take Kyiv in 3 days, and the fight is still going on. And where are we now in terms of war negotiations and general situation with the war in Ukraine? And from your perspective, has Putin actually stepped back from its ambitious, maybe to take all of Ukraine?
Well, I think where we are now, I think it's clear that Putin's plan has not worked out. I think that's obvious. His two main goals for the war were the demilitarization and the denazification of Ukraine, as he called them. So if we take demilitarization, Ukraine is now the biggest and the strongest military in Europe. So clearly that's been a very significant failure. And if we look at denazification, which essentially is Kremlin code for the eradication of Ukrainian national identity as a separate identity, it's also been a major failure because Ukraine has never been more Ukrainian. We see that in every aspect of life here, and it's never been more separate from Russia either. So, the two key goals of the war, I think, have clearly not been achieved by the Russians. They've clearly failed to do that. But I don't think that Putin has modified his goals long term. I don't think he can really. He's way past the point of no return, and he has to keep pushing to try and achieve these goals. And somehow, perhaps my assumption is that he hopes that if he keeps going, he can get to the point where at some point the West will lose interest, the West will reduce its support, and Ukraine itself, Ukraine's military resistance will collapse. Ukraine's society may collapse. So he's still pushing toward that goal. And I don't think he has really many other options than trying to do that because he's committed so much to this. He's transformed Russia around this war and through this war, and he's basically tied his entire legacy to this war, to this invasion. So he really is, he's trapped in a war now that he doesn't seem to have a way to win, doesn't seem to have an obvious pathway to victory, but he can't get out of it really.
Is it a deadlock for him?
Well, it's a very tricky situation. It's certainly not what he would have expected. I think that's clear. We know that, his expectations were, and the expectations of everybody in Russia were for a quick victory. But he's overcommitted now. Where's he going to go now? If he were to turn around, if we look at the options that are available to him, if he were to turn around now and say, okay, we're going to agree to a compromise peace, we're going to take the territories that we have now and we're going to accept them and we're going to allow the rest of Ukraine, so 20% of Ukraine, which is under Russian occupation, would be taken to Russia, either de jure or more likely de facto, but 80% of Ukraine would be free. And that 80% of Ukraine, the Ukrainian state, would continue on its pathway to European integration, would become a very important element of European security, would have a very large and strong army, would very likely join the European Union in the coming few years. that's a major defeat for Russia. That's a major historic defeat for Russia. Putin would then, instead of being the man remembered for, the conqueror of Crimea or the reviver of the Russian Empire, he'd be the man who lost Ukraine.
And yesterday it was a special day for Russian army, maybe from the Soviet time, this 23rd of February day. And Putin also did a special speech for Russian soldiers. And basically the main idea is that he is calling for a total mobilization of Russian population. And actually the question is, how much longer can Russia sustain this war? And what story is Putin selling to Russians basically to continue this fight against Ukraine?
That's a very good question, and it's difficult to quantify exactly how long they can keep fighting. I think that Putin's been very, 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 very cunning in the way that he's recruited soldiers for the war, because he understands that one of the big threats he has is of conscripting and forcing large amounts of Russians to go and fight in Ukraine. He knows that would be very, very, very unpopular, and when he tried to do that in 2022, with the mobilization, it was a disaster. Basically, yes, they managed to mobilize the required number of men, but perhaps a million Russians fled the country. We had images of Russians, queuing up to get into Georgia and Kazakhstan. It was humiliating for Putin and very damaging for Russia's very damaging for Russia's prestige, as it were, internationally. So he doesn't want it is destabilizing. So he doesn't want to do that again. So he's been very clever in terms of finding ways of keeping the army recruited, keeping his recruitment up without risking this sort of destabilization. So he's been taking people from the poorest elements of Russia, from the ethnic minorities, the Dagestanis and so on. He's been taking people from the prison populations. And most of all, he's been taking volunteers and paying them very, very good money. And I think as I understand it now, volunteers make up the majority of new recruits coming into the army by far. And that's very convenient for the Russians, I think, and for Putin in particular, because when these guys die, which many of them do, there's not a lot of sympathy for them in the Russian society, because people are inclined to say, well, they made their choice. They knew it was dangerous. They wanted these large payments of money, and they went into the army, and this is a risk they took, and they took it knowingly, and they chose to do that. They are volunteers. So if he can keep the flow of volunteers going, I think he's got a good chance of continuing with his current offensive operations for a significant amount of time. I don't know exactly. I mean, how many? We're talking years here, but I think it could be a year, could be 2 years or more. I mean, it really depends on at what point they start to exhaust that resource, the volunteers, because as I understand it, the prisons are almost half empty now. They've taken all the prisoners. There's not a lot of more prisoners coming in, but the volunteers are the key factor, because if he can keep them coming, and again, he has to keep the payments for them coming, and that's not easy, because they are spending a lot of money on these guys. They're giving them $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 payments just to sign up, and then they're paying them high salaries and so on. So that's also an economic factor here. If the Russian economy continues to take a hit, continues to struggle as it's already doing, that's going to be difficult. Now, I think Putin will use whatever resources he has available to him for the war. He'll prioritize it. So he'll take money from elsewhere. But then we get into a sort of downward spiral where Putin's taking money from everywhere else in the Russian economy and Russian society, pouring it into the war, and then creating potential for destabilization elsewhere when people start saying, well, hold on, the infrastructure's crumbling, education, healthcare, and so on and so forth. So it can create a lot of stresses for his system of government, for his state, essentially, if they continue down this road. But I think at this point, he's organised it in a way that sort of minimises the risk from any public dissent or opposition due to the high losses they're taking. He's organised so that people are basically saying, okay, these guys they've made their choice. That's up to them, and there's not a huge amount. It's not like, for example, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when it was a conscript army, and a far, far lower number of casualties caused a big backlash because they were conscripts, and people were saying, this is a crime, this is outrageous. That's not the case now, because people are making their own choices.
But do you think that people, for example, in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, they are feeling the consequences of the war or not, because also of these volunteers who want to fight for money?
Well, I think probably in Moscow and St. Petersburg, no. But I think if you went to smaller towns, yes, you would see it more. I mean, that's another factor. Putin's been very careful to minimise the impact on the power centres in Russia, which are, there's really just two major cities which dominate Russia's business and political elite. And he's been very careful to make sure that they do not feel a very strong negative impact from all this. So they probably aren't particularly disrupted or upset by what's going on at this point, or at least their daily lives aren't very badly impacted. He's going to do everything to make sure that continues. But again, if you go to smaller cities, if you go to regional towns and villages and out into the middle of nowhere, then you'll see a very different picture where we see reports of entire villages where like half the male population has been killed in the war.
Interesting also point that they cannot protect Kursk or Belgorod because of Ukrainian attacks. The cities are left without electricity, and Russians just crazy about it. It's also maybe could be an important target due to their war.
Well, I mean, they've concentrated. Russia's great strength historically has always been its size. That's always been its great advantage, its greatest military sort of trump card. It's famously armies go into Russia, have gone into Russia in the past, and have basically just got lost in the vastness of the country. What Ukraine is doing now, I think, is using Russia's vastness against it. By attacking Russia, by launching drone attacks, and now increasingly cruise missile attacks with the advent and the rise and the growing effectiveness of the Flamingo rockets in particular, it makes life very difficult for the Russians because they simply don't have enough air defences to protect this enormous airspace. I mean, we're talking about an absolutely colossal amount of territory. I mean, Ukraine has experience of that as well. Obviously, there's a lot of parts of Ukraine aren't very well covered by air defences, but Ukraine is tiny compared to Russia. Russia is so vast that there are places, as you mentioned, especially in the border regions, they can't protect them because they've concentrated all their air defences, again, like with the recruitment, or they've concentrated all their air defences. It's Moscow, it's St. Petersburg, it's Putin's palaces, it's the palaces of some other guys. They've concentrated their air defences there, and they also use the air defences in the war in Ukraine, the invasion. So there's a lot of gaps there, a lot of gaps all over the country, and I don't know how they can resolve that because it's simply too big. Russia is just too big.
Ukrainian forces have launched counteroffensive actions after Russian troops were cut off from Starlink terminals and also from Messenger Telegram. And President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, says that Ukrainian soldiers have liberated around 300 square kilometers of territory in the southern part of Ukraine, basically the Zaporizhia region. And how would you describe the situation on the ground, especially? Do you think that Russian forces are already feeling the pressure, of course, due to these cutoffs?
Well, I think they're certainly feeling the pressure because they lost some very key communication tools, and communication is absolutely crucial for any army. And I think it's interesting that the Russians allowed themselves to become so dependent on what is an American system. The Starlink is an American system. So it's interesting that they felt so comfortable and so confident that would not be cut off. I think that's worth looking at it as separately, perhaps. But anyway, they did lose that. They have lost that, and that's a big issue for them. They'll find ways around it in time. They already are finding some ways around it, and as time goes by, they'll solve that problem to a degree. They'll find some replacements or some alternatives, perhaps not quite as effective, but they'll be able to work something out. But for the time being, I think they're vulnerable. What we're seeing at the moment, these Ukrainian counteroffensives, I think it's quite questionable the extent to which these territories were fully occupied by the Russians. Were they just occupied by infiltration groups, by small numbers of people? I think the Russians have a tendency to exaggerate their advances. We saw this most famously with Putin claiming that he'd taken Kupiansk again and again and again late last year, and even still now. So this is a tendency that the Russians have, that they like to take things on credit, as it were. They like to claim that they've taken all these places. So I think probably we're not talking about fully occupied territories, we're talking about areas in the grey zone where the Russians had established a presence and they've now been pushed back. So I think what Ukraine is doing now is not necessarily launching a large-scale offensive operations. They're pushing the Russians back and they're looking to establish stronger defensive positions because now we're coming into spring. The spring season will see again major Russian offensive operations. So the Ukrainians now are looking to prepare for that. They're looking to establish strong defensive positions in advance of what everybody expects to be another wave of a big Russian push. So the Ukrainians are going to try and set things up so that they're in a position to stop the Russians and also to inflict very high levels of casualties on the Russians.
According to the article in the Times, NATO believes Ukraine could turn the course of the war, but only if two conditions are met. First is mobilizing at least 250,000 additional troops and receiving modern weaponry from the Western countries, of course. And do you think that strategic is realistic enough, and also for Ukrainian side to mobilize, additional soldiers, and also for the West to provide additional help as soon as possible?
Well, 250,000 soldiers is a lot for a country that's fought for 4 years like Ukraine has and suffered very high casualties. And I think that a lot, the Ukrainians who were ready to fight are fighting now. And they will be able to mobilise more people, but 250,000 is a big ask. So I would question whether that's a realistic figure at this point. Can the West provide more weapons? Certainly, yeah. I mean, they certainly can, and one would hope they would do that. The West, Europeans move slowly. It takes a long time for them to get things moving, and we're still now starting to see results arriving from processes that were begun years ago in the early stages of the war in terms of armaments and manufacturing of weapons. So I think it's realistic to expect them to get for Ukraine to receive more weapons, more military equipment from its European partners. But I think the numbers there are optimistic in terms of Ukraine's mobilization potential. Let's see. I mean, there certainly is a lot of potential still there, but that seems like a lot, especially in a short period of time. I think that Ukraine at this point is not looking to launch major offensive operations. I think Ukraine's goal at the moment, as I understand it, is to hold the front, to inflict maximum casualties on the Russians. So the Russians find themselves in a situation where they're not making any progress, they're suffering very high losses, and at the same time to be increasing attacks inside Russia on the military-industrial complex, on the energy industry, on the Russian economy, so that the Russians so Putin finds himself in a position where his economy is tanking, his energy cash cow is basically being destroyed, and his army is not making any progress and is being decimated in Ukraine. I think they're the conditions then that can that can move this towards some sort of a settlement. The idea of Ukraine mobilizing another big army and sweeping through and winning the war on the battlefield, for me, it seems unrealistic at this point.
Let's also talk about the peace negotiations. Zelensky says he's ready to meet dictator Putin, but progress so far has been only on the technical level, but not on the political questions. And do you actually believe that a face-to-face meeting with Putin could actually happen, and that it could lead to a real peace agreement afterwards?
No, I mean, I'm very skeptical that Putin would meet Zelensky. I mean, I think the Russian position and Putin's personal position has always been that Ukraine is not a legitimate state, and Zelensky, his attempts to suggest that Zelensky is not legitimate is part of that. It's basically saying, well, Ukraine is not legitimate, Zelensky is not legitimate, none of it's legitimate. It's all Russia. So I don't think he'd be prepared to sit down with Zelensky, because that would legitimize Zelensky, and that's something that Putin is very, 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 very determined not to do. That's kind of fundamental for him. Of course, again, if things change, as I just laid out, potentially, if the situation changes and the tide turns dramatically against Russia, maybe, but I think it looks very unlikely that Putin would want to sit down, or would be prepared to sit down, or would be even brave enough to sit down with Zelensky, because it would undermine some very fundamental aspects of his entire position. The entire sort of rationale behind the war.
Today, Zelensky said that Ukraine is ready to freeze the war along the current front, but won't hand over 20% of Donbas. From your perspective, could Russia ever agree to a peace without taking at least Donbas? Because now it seems it's the main, their red line.
Well, I mean, how important is the Donbas for the Russians? I mean, Russia is this huge country, the biggest country in the world by far. They don't need this 20% of the Donbas. They don't need it, obviously, and it doesn't have any great historical value for the Russians either. Kramatorsk and Sloviansk are not ancient Russian cities. I mean, they have a history going back a couple hundred years, perhaps. We're not talking about very, very historically important places, or even very, very big population centres. So I don't think there's any real argument from the Russian side that they must have this territory. I think Russia wants it for Russia pushes for it for two reasons. One, it keeps negotiations going because they know Ukraine can't accept this demand. So it's a way of basically playing for time, stalling, making impossible demands, knowing that Ukraine will say no in order to push the negotiations on, because they don't want to make a peace deal here. They don't want to do it. So it's actually an excuse to maintain this fake peace process, as it were, this phony peace process. And the other aspect of the argument here is that they are looking to take that area because it's very heavily fortified. So it would have, although it doesn't have a great symbolic value to the Russians, it does have a strategic value. If they were to take that territory, it would remove one of arguably Ukraine's most important defences, and it would open up the way for Russia to push much further into Ukraine from a very advantageous position. So, there's a military rationale here as well. There's a military argument here why that's important for Russia. But I think, it's not politically important for the Russians. It's the Russians could agree on peace without taking that area if they wanted peace, if they wanted to end the war. And I think this is what Trump finds so difficult to understand, because Trump's saying to them, well, look, I've basically got the Ukrainians to agree that you can keep the territory you've taken, this 20%. You can keep it. 2 years ago, all the talk was everything must be freed, Russia must be pushed back. Now, it's on the table. It's there. You can take it. And Trump, the real estate magnate, he sees it as a geopolitical real estate deal. He's like, well, you've got it. Take it. And the Russians are saying no, because it's not enough for them. They have to get the whole of Ukraine.
Actually, about Trump, he's of course pushing for this peace settlement, and every time in media we see different deadlines. This time Bloomberg reports about the willing of peace settlement before the Independence Day celebration. It's the 4th of July in the US. Actually, do you see that this deadline, another deadline, is realistic, or this year, the 2026 year, is actually realistic to end the war?
Well, I think Trump's deadlines are not to be taken very seriously. I mean, we've seen a lot of deadlines over the last year coming from Trump. We've seen, the famous 24 hours when he came into power that he was going to end the war. And then we've seen, repeatedly the 2 weeks for Putin, giving him more time, and now we've seen, a number of occasions he's set supposed deadlines for Ukraine and then walked it back and said, no, we won't have, we're not going to take any drastic action if things don't happen at that time. So this summer is a very important time, very symbolic, important time for the Americans, because they're celebrating 250 years of their independence. So it's a very big Independence Day this year, and Trump would love to have a victory or a triumph, as it were, a peacemaking triumph to celebrate there. So certainly he would like that, but I don't think that the Ukrainians, or certainly the Russians, will take those dates very seriously, or will take, will work toward those dates for Trump. Trump also has his midterm elections in November, which he, at the moment, although it's very early to say, he looks like he's going to have a lot of trouble with, or the Republican Party at least will have a lot of trouble with. They could suffer quite a bad defeat. So he would like to have some sort of victories to bolster his position there. But I don't see it being a big factor in the peace talks. I think the peace talks will revolve around Russia's ability to continue the war. And that depends very heavily on Ukraine's ability to stop the Russians on the front line, and again to bring the war to Russia and inflict damage inside Russia.
So this year we will actually probably will see the fight is continuing?
I think most likely, the most likely scenario is that it will continue. Again, these are the key factors, the extent to which Russia is able to continue advancing and the extent to which Ukraine is able to bring the war to Russia. Mostly that will be in terms of attacks, aerial attacks, bombardments inside Russia. There'll be other factors as well. The sanctions factor will play a role, maybe other geopolitical factors, but I think they're going to be the key things to look at. How Ukraine is able to strengthen its defences on the front lines, on the battlefield here, and how they're able to impose greater costs on Russia, both on the front lines here in terms of the Russian military, the army, but also in Russia itself.
Peter, thank you very much for this discussion and for your support to Ukraine.
Thank you.